I'm going to try it again. Dr. Efrat Ginot,
Very good.
welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate you having me. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to have you here, and your name is a little bit of a tongue twister for me, but hopefully I'll get it down.
Yes, that's okay.
Where is your name from?
Israel. I was born in Israel.
Born in Israel. Yeah, I thought
Yes.
it was maybe some kind of a Hebrew name. I wasn't sure.
Yes, the Hebrew name, exactly.
Yeah. So we're going to be discussing your new book, Our Anxious Selves, Neuropsychological Processes and Their Enduring Influence on Who We Are. Would it be okay if before we start talking about your book, if we could delve a bit into your background?
Sure, of course.
Well, we've just found out that you were born in Israel. What sort of family did you come up in?
So, as many in my generation, and it really bears some significance to what I've been working on and writing all these years. I come from a family of 2 Holocaust survivors, both my mother and my father. And growing up with the anxiety that had to do with that, and understanding the process on my flesh, right? Only in hindsight, I could analyze it, but at the moment of this intergenerational transmission of all the stuff that they went through. So yeah, for years, and I'm the older of 2 sisters. My sister kind of took a different route with that. She left the house earlier. And I was marinating more in all that anxious world of the past for a while. That's very typical of such second generation.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I missed a word. Did you say Holocaust survivors, or was there some other? Yeah, Holocaust survivors.
Yeah. Holocaust survivors, yes.
Yeah. And so clearly anxiety was an issue
absolutely
early on. And as you say, some of it transmitted generationally, which is something we've begun to understand and acknowledge.
That's right. That's right.
What did you imagine yourself wanting to be when you grew up?
You know, the other joke amongst second generation, a lot of us are therapists. Because some of the impulses are about taking care of the parents, especially my mother, who seemed way more fragile than my father. But yeah, there's an impulse to take care of them, to make their lives easier, to kind of soothe them from all that stuff. Yes. So I kind of had it in my head I was going to.
Yeah. So you somehow you knew about therapists, you heard about therapists, or you knew therapists growing up?
Not quite, but once I went to the university for my first degree, I started to work at a mental hospital. So, and since then it just took,
Yeah, and at what point did you first discover psychoanalysis? When did you first hear about Freud and psychoanalysis and all of that?
I think, fairly early, because in Israel, the degree is specific. So my degree in clinical psychology is specific. It's like a little bit like graduate school here. It's not like a general fine art degree. So even through my BA and certainly through my MA, we had a lot of education about Freud and Adler and all of those first Jung, all of those first figures in psychoanalysis, yes.
So eventually you became a psychoanalyst. What about it spoke to you? You probably had some exposure to other approaches and knew that there were other approaches in the world, maybe. What was it about psychoanalysis that really spoke to you?
Yeah, not so much at the beginning. Psychoanalysis was it.
Was it? Yeah.
And I have veered away from it. I don't know if you took a look at my first book about the unconscious, really veers away from the more traditional views of the unconscious. But I became a psychoanalyst. I went to the NYU postdoctorate program. For me, it was really, the important thing was to become aware of how we work, what makes us tick,
Yeah.
and then trying to make our lives easier. And the third thing that was so important to me that I did not find in psychoanalysis so much is a sense of total non-judgment. So I also became a little bit enamored with the Buddhist kind of approach, the non-judgmental observing faculties that we can develop as therapists. So my relationship to psychoanalysis is complex because I do a lot of dynamic work, but I've incorporated a lot of mindfulness work,
Oh, yeah.
all kinds of techniques and CBT stuff and DBT and
Yes,
all
I
these
got
things that
that
work.
from your book. That really comes across
Yes,
in your book, that
yes, yeah,
you really have expanded your horizon. It's interesting
yes,
that you were drawn to the Buddhist perspective for being non-judgmental. And I went
yes,
through a graduate program at the University of Michigan that at the time happened to be very psychoanalytic in its orientation. I just happened to end up there. There was
yes,
nothing in me that said, oh, I want to study psychoanalysis. And my take on it, my young self, and I had all kinds of issues, I'm sure, but to me, it seemed judgmental. And,
yes, exactly,
and I resisted the idea that everything was pathological,
exactly.
everything was pathological. Everybody
Yes.
was different only in the degrees of pathology that they suffered from. Now you
So,
mentioned, go ahead.
so I just want to say, so interesting you say that, because this is what I try to achieve in both my books, but especially in this one. We
Yeah,
all suffer because of the way the brain is made. We all have anxiety. We all concoct all kinds of self states. We all make up stuff in a way that distorting our sense of self because of the anxiety. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly that.
yeah. Now you mentioned an earlier book on the unconscious, and you said that the view that you put forth in there was maybe different than the Freudian classical
Yes,
idea.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
can you, I want to spend most of the time on your current book, but can you sort of encapsulate
Yeah,
the idea of that book?
yeah. You know, the more traditional view, and of course everything is like changing now pretty rapidly, is that it was like an encapsulated space that contained all kind of wishes and traumatic material stuff we had to defend against. So there was some like a little man there, a little woman that says, no, you stay out, you stay in.
Yeah.
And that doesn't work. It's not born by anything. The unconscious is with us all the time. It's really a function of how the brain, mind, body work together.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yeah. And in my later years, I was drawn to the Jungian perspective. And one of the things I liked about Jung was that his view of the unconscious wasn't just the id riddled negative part,
that's right.
but also other more positive and potentialities and so on. So I think we're on the same page there.
Also, because the brain's tendency to enact what it knows and how it works so rapidly and automatically, the unconscious is really not that hidden. It's being enacted all the time in how we speak, how we talk, how we view the world, how we act. Yeah,
Exactly.
there's some memories we don't have access to, a lot of
Yeah.
stuff, but it's
Yeah.
enacted.
Yes. So when and how did you develop your expertise in neuroscience? Because there's a lot of that in the book as well.
So neuroscience always interested me, even as a young student, let's say. And when I started to work, I've worked almost, I don't know, 35 years by now, maybe a little bit more. I really tried to understand why it's so hard to change. Even when we want to, even when we decide, I'm not going to do it again, I'm not going to repeat this, I'm going to behave differently. It's really hard. So this was one of the questions. And I couldn't find an easy answer in any of the psychodynamic. They would say, oh, secondary, yeah, I'm sure the secondary
Secondary
some
gains.
reward,
Oh,
gains,
yeah,
rewards, yes.
yeah.
Or that we attach to some mother, father figure that won't let us change. All of wasn't satisfactory to me. The other question was, it still is, why most of us, I won't say all, but most, we have that very negative self-state about our self-worth, about all our conflict. It's like a state that is riddled with stuff. And it's so universal. So together, these two kind of observations led me to the one conclusion that it's a combination of how we all are physiological creatures, how the brain works with the mind, the brain and the mind are the same, the brain, mind, and body are the same.
Yeah,
They form a unit.
yes. And you observe that fairly universally, there is your observation that many people have a place where they're kind of stuck, despite
Yes,
their conscious resolutions,
that's right,
et
exactly.
cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, you would think we are such rational beings. Why can't we control ourselves a bit more?
Yeah, right.
Hard work. Yeah.
Hard work. So why this particular book at this particular time?
So I've been thinking about this topic of anxiety a long time, working with patients. And increasingly I thought that, yeah, it can explain a lot, of why we stuck, why from very early age we already subjected to all these forces that the fear system has, or anxiety. From the 7th month of pregnancy or 8th month, when the amygdala is already active, it affects our fear, and it affects a lot of the connections that are happening in the brain. And when I read that the amygdala, let's say the fear system, is connected to all the circuits in all the areas in the brain,
Yeah,
it makes a lot of sense. It affects how we think from very early age. Our attention, what we put attention, negative, positive, it affects our expectations, our worldview, how we think of ourselves. In this one, self-state. In more severe cases, it takes over and then it's all negative. But most of us walk around with more than one self-state. Yeah.
yeah. And who's your ideal reader for this book? Did you have somebody in
Yeah.
mind, a picture in your
Yeah.
mind?
I was hoping therapists, because I think it really can teach therapists to be really not judgmental. And when you understand that it's a brain, mind, body thing, that we all are subjected to all kinds of forces from evolution, right?
Yeah,
That are affecting us, it helps patients to be more compassionate towards themselves too, right?
yeah,
To be less judgmental about why they're feeling what they're feeling, or
yeah.
thinking
So
what they're thinking.
yeah, so your ideal audience is to reach out to therapists and also maybe people who are
Yes.
in therapy or contemplating therapy,
Yes, exactly.
struggling
Yeah.
to understand themselves.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Parents,
I'm sorry.
parents
Oh,
also
parents. Yeah,
who are
that's,
raising small kids.
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A central premise of your book is that fear and anxiety are pervasive. And that makes a lot of sense to me. Um, from another perspective of, I guess, the existential perspective that I was influenced by early
Mm.
on, that just being alive, being, the situation that we find ourselves in the world,
That's right.
it's ultimately anxiety arousing, and particularly the particularly death. If you think about death and that we have a finite existence, if that idea ever strikes you, that can
That's
be a
right.
pretty
Yes.
terrifying, anxiety
Yes.
arousing thing.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
you talk about fear and anxiety. Do you differentiate between fear and anxiety, or are they the same thing?
It's interesting. It has been debated in the research
Yep.
community and
Yeah.
theoretically. So I think for now, people think that fear is more focused. It lasts shorter time. It's something very immediate and that's about to happen. Anxiety is more the manifestation of a chronic state of fear. It
Uh-huh.
doesn't go away,
Yeah.
right? It
Well,
becomes chronic and then it really has, life of its own
yeah.
that it develops. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned the fear system in the brain,
Mhm.
and that's an intriguing idea. I don't know if I've heard it referred to as the fear system. So tell us about the fear system. What are the components of the brain, or that makes it a system?
Right. So that is based on John Panksepp's work.
Yes, I interviewed
And
him actually years ago.
oh, unfortunately, he's no longer with us.
Right.
Uh, but he did some brilliant work, neuropsychological work on the emotional systems in the brain.
Hmm.
And he came up with 7, and he did it on mice, he did it on all kinds of rodents and stuff, but he has some very interesting finding. Of course, some of the findings are particular to humans, but he could have sworn he would play us tapes that the mice were laughing and giggling, the cubs, small
Oh
mice,
yeah, right.
because, yeah, because he came up with 7 systems, like the panic and joy and play and seeking. I mean, the 7, and fear is one of them. And the other person who worked maybe you interviewed him too, extensively with fear is, of course, Ledoux, Joseph Ledoux. He is one of the most prolific people who dealt specifically with the amygdala in the fear system. He, so there's a lot of stuff there. So the way that and there's a couple of people like Anderson and Adolphs, they're actually from the West Coast, also deal with the emotional systems of the brain. So the idea today is that they can identify the circuits that process emotions. And as Damasio said, the emotion really is a physical thing, right? The body, something happens to the body sends all kinds of messages to these particular systems, the insula and other circuits in the brain that processes, we can feel it. So, but what is so interesting about emotions that we feel it in the body, right? And
Yes.
we feel what we feel. And then, of course, we put words on it, what we feel, right? We
Yeah.
put words. And then it becomes a very intertwined kind of entity, feelings, at least the way I see it, right? The feeling would be the sensations, the words we put to it, the actions we take, right?
Yeah.
So
And
all of that.
yeah, we not only put words to them, but then we get attached to those words, right? We get attached to the description, to our story in a sense,
That's
to
right. That's a
our conscious
narrative,
story. Yeah, our narrative.
the narrative. Yeah, exactly. Which, by the way, the narratives are very influenced, like everything else, by our emotions. So if you have a negative narrative, like low self-esteem, I'm not good, everybody else is better than me, and all of that, it is influenced by early anxiety, and then an immature brain comes up with all kinds of explanations which are immature. I mean, in the
Yeah.
sense of not related to reality. Yeah.
Yeah. That's one of the things I noticed early on as a student is that uh, we are excellent at coming up with explanations. We can always come up with an explanation, it may or may not be factual, but, you know, we kind of are good at rationalizing, if you will. Yeah.
Right, because we are, in essence, we are built, and it's built in from evolution. We are creatures that seek meaning. Hence the whole idea of God and nature and all of that. We need to find meaning and explanation.
Yes. Yes. And that's another reason why I'm drawn to Jung, is because he really goes in, his is a psychology of meaning.
Yes.
And I find that
Exactly.
meaningful.
Yes. Yeah.
You mentioned, you've referenced some researchers and theoreticians here, and I want to let our audience know that your book is, you have a table, you have a list of references at the back of the book, and there are many, a lot of information is woven into the account without it being obtrusive, or it's not tons of footnotes and so on. Sometimes it's hard to get through a book because your eye has to leave the narrative and go down and figure, okay, now where was I? And so I'm glad that your book doesn't do that. It's actually a readable book. And
Thank you. That I
yeah,
really try to.
yeah, and it's very comprehensive. You really, as you pointed out early in our discussion, I think you've achieved what you were trying to do, which is to throw a really wide net, and not to, you know, even though you have this background as a psychoanalyst and your current practice in that is in no ways limited. I mean, you're talking positively about behavior therapy, and I think you do mention narrative therapy,
Yes.
and
Yes.
a lot about mindfulness.
Mhm.
So I'm kind of looking through some of my notes here that I have, maybe about, see if I can find some other places to take us. You talk about the duality of our psychological lives, and that was
Yes.
that phrase kind of leapt out at me. So why don't you expand on that for us? What is this
Yes.
duality of our psychological lives that you're talking
Yes.
about?
So this is one of the more interesting things that I also noticed, and I'm sure every therapist, every practitioner notices similarly, is that we are not monolithic. We are not made, most of us, unless we, again, in some kind of a really psychotic break or really particular, maybe disorder, we are made of parts, like Philip Bromberg wrote so much about, right? We have more than one self-state or pattern, if you want, or schema. People call it all kinds of different things. I like
Right.
self-state because it's a state that combines everything. Each state has its own feelings and thoughts and ideas and acting. A lot of it is unconscious and just being enacted. So let's say you talk to a patient one session and they're really down, dumps, and really down on themselves, and relate an incident in the office, how they felt very worthless and people didn't respect that, whatever it is that they come with. And then the next session, let's say we talk, we work it through, the next session they're in a different place, in a more resilient, in a more reality bound, what I call reality bound place. Because when they are in the other place, many times we are not aware that there's another place that is not what we feel. In the reality, that person is achieving, is doing well. Yes, so they had some kind of dysregulation. But we forget the positive, the resilient, when we are in the throes of the bad, the negative part.
Yes, yes, yes.
So we all are made of dualities. And this is also the brain work, I think. Good, bad, reward, punishment. It really
Yeah.
comes from that, I think.
And, you know, I love the cosmological principle, again, going back to Jung and to Buddhist thought, the idea of yin and yang, that
Exactly.
that there's always the struggle of opposites within
Mm-hmm.
us, and that seems to be kind of a
Mm-hmm.
universal
Yes.
principle.
That's right.
And as you mentioned, but it may not just be two parts, but there can be multiple
Exactly.
parts.
I know. I
And,
kindly reduced it to two, but it's true. And it's so interesting. I really think it starts with that, the way the brain works. From the very beginning, does it feel good or does it feel bad? When mommy doesn't come to me when I cry, it feels bad. She comes to me, she nurses me, it feels good. So it builds on those kind of very immediate, innate tendency to evaluate the environment.
well, I think that's
And
one of Freud's ideas, that really uh, the idea of the pleasure principle, that
that's right. Yeah.
it really makes sense, and I'm also thinking in terms of the different parts, how we may find ourselves one way with one group of people and a
That's
different
right.
way in another group of people,
That's right.
or
Even with
y-
one person,
yeah,
in our
or,
marriages, in our relationships.
yeah, right. But I remember, I think of myself as, at least at this point in my life, I maybe always kind of introverted, but when I was in the role of being a teacher or professor, I would appear to be very extroverted, right? Because I would perform. So both are in there.
Yeah.
I can be a very shy, withdrawn person, but I can also be a very
Exactly.
extroverted person
Yes.
and take it.
Yes.
Usually I don't take up a lot of space, but if I need to, I can take up some space.
And how do you feel? Does two parts live well with each other?
Yeah, I think so, mostly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm fairly well along on the path of self-acceptance, but these little
Yeah.
things, they crop up. Their little tentacles pop up every now and then, right? And particularly you do refer to the pandemic, and
Yeah.
that this is sort of one of the major existential crises of our time. And so you talk about, well, how do we balance those two things, right?
Yeah.
And let's talk about that now. Where do you come
So
out with that?
right. It really on many levels, unfortunately. And if we start of how it affected kids, let's say, it's not just the kids couldn't go to school, which is terrible enough in its own, but the parents, the adults around them, the anxieties, a little bit akin to how I grew up. It's something that envelops the whole atmosphere in the house. There's something bad going on.
Yeah,
And the parents feel it. They could not feel it, even if
right.
they try to shield the kid. You can't. At the end, they feel what they feel. And so even on that level only, then all the social isolation, the
Yes.
idea, the danger at the beginning, the ambiguity of it, not knowing when and how, if ever, it was gonna end.
Yes.
The disease, the physical dangers at the beginning, that was part of this whole thing, all these people dying, right? There was so much there, so condensed in a relatively short period of time, especially the first year. When did we have the vaccine? After like a year and a half, I forget already. It was everything, gets mushed together, but in a relatively short period of time, a lot of traumatic kind of processes that affected both the parents and the children and adolescents, especially. They were cut off from friends, from their social life,
Yeah,
from
they
their
miss a
milieu.
whole lot of developmental stages
That's right.
that would be
Exactly.
facilitated by interacting with their peers.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And also by interacting more widely with adults than, say, being stuck just with their family.
Oh, that's exactly. That's an edit thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
The place that I recall you come out in the book is that what we can hope for is to become integrated people, to walk the fine line of knowing that, okay, there's all of this stuff is going on, not be in denial about it, do what we can to help make the world a better place, and at the same time be aware of our own inner resources and hopefully the resources of our fellows and society.
Do you know what's so difficult with the just think about anxiety and how it affects us vis-a-vis what we're talking about? Because anxiety per se is not the problem per se, right? Because it's part of being alive, it's part of how the brain works. But the inability to tolerate it, and that's innate, like Panksepp said, he said that it's such an unpleasant sensation that all creatures try to get away from. And the example I always give is that even in an amoeba, if you shine a light on it, right, in the little petri dish, it runs away because it doesn't like the light. So flies from all levels of the evolution, all creatures experiences it, and nobody likes it. It's an unpleasant feeling.
Yeah,
so this is
I've noticed that. And not being a great Buddhist, I sometimes find I want to squash bugs that are in the house, that they don't belong here. And I'm amazed at how skilled they are at trying to get away and save themselves. Yeah.
That's exactly right.
And they,
yes.
They frantically struggle to preserve themselves.
That's exactly right. And so do we, obviously, on a different level.
Right.
But I think it's the same primal instinct. And this is why when stuff doesn't work well, or we have a predisposition for anxiety, so everything in the environment makes it worse, we want to run away from it. And instinctively, we come up with defenses. But I think there's no way around learning to tolerate some of it. We got to learn to tolerate some anxiety.
Yeah.
And realize it ain't going to kill us. Yes. And understand what it's doing to us. Yes.
And that's
the
a lot of
people who go to war, people who go to war are anxious about whatever power, whatever, they don't stop and think, why am I doing it?
One of the things that you emphasize is psychological flexibility, and there's a whole literature that's developed around that, which is to be able to, and in Jungian psychology, they talk about the ability to tolerate the opposites, or to hold the opposites. And I think that's also talking about a kind of psychological flexibility, to resist the pull to one side or the other, to say, oh, it's all this or it's all that. Well, it's more than just this or just that. Yeah.
I believe that will be maybe, hopefully, the next developmental passage for human being, for species, because we are not good at that. It's either or at this point, really.
Yeah.
It's either you're with us, against us. I have the power, you have the power. I believe this is where we have to go. Otherwise, we're gonna extinct ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a real debate about whether that's possible or not. Two views of human nature there, right?
That's exactly right. So you know what Ledoux said about that? Ledoux said this part, the prefrontal cortex, right, which is very entwined with everything, but at least nominally is the seat of the executive function. It's supposed to kind of teach us mindfulness and planning and reasoning and analysis, right, to analyze stuff. But he said we don't have any more space for it to develop. So we're stuck with this prefrontal cortex, but maybe the chips that are going to come will take off some of the functions.
You're even open to considering that?
Absolutely. If it
Abs-
makes us better, more
uh,
integrated human beings, yes.
yeah, yeah,
Not killing each other, yes.
yeah. So it's all about integration. And I'm thinking of the corpus callosum, the tissue that connects the two
That's right.
hemispheres.
That's right.
And that's there for a reason, obviously, that we are intended to draw from, to
That's right.
utilize our whole brain, our whole self, rather than just become over, lopsided. Yeah.
Yes.
What have we not touched on here that maybe you were hoping that we would talk about?
Yeah, so I would like people to understand in general how they're made to kind of be curious about themselves,
Uh-huh.
right? To ask questions about their repeated patterns. And again, non-judgmentally, to understand that because of the way the unconscious works, because of the way the brain works, a lot of what we do is we enact habits, feeling habits, relational habits, emotional habits. I mean, in a very big sense, habits, not like just riding a bike, but it's not very different in the brain, right? Because when the first patterns are being laid down from the very beginning of life, they build on themselves. So emotion goes in it, thoughts goes in it, and it becomes a pattern that just when it's being activated or triggered, it's just getting enacted. And you can see it in couples. You can see how they react to each other so automatically. It's so well oiled, all of us do that. So I think to just be curious to say, what is this pattern about? Why am I repeating myself? I need to stop. I need to slow down, not to stop the behavior because we can't, it's not easy, but to slow down, to stop and think. So this
Uh-huh.
is one thing, to be curious. The other thing is to understand that emotions and cognitions are not different in a sense that they're separate, they're very entwined in the brain/mind. It's
Uh-huh.
kind of was
Yes.
a fallacy to totally differentiate between the mind
Yeah.
and the body, mind and affect. They're very connected in the brain and in our feelings, in our experiences.
You're talking about your hope um, for our evolution. What do you think about the evolution of psychotherapy? How do you think that psychotherapy is evolving, and what are your
Now
observations? Yeah.
I come from New York, which is still very psychoanalytic and does not so much put stock in the neuroscience and CBT or DBT, whatever the newer behavioral approaches. But it's being dragged kicking and screaming because there's no way not to understand that words in themselves, just talking about things, may not be enough. And that insight, it may not be enough. In order to change, we need to practice, talk about the Buddhist way, right? To really put our behavior in a way that is a little bit different. Because the brain needs to learn different ways of being. Just talking about it once a week, twice a week, even 4 times a week, it often is not enough. We need to, in real time, to struggle with what all these difficult things are in real time. When I'm anxious, when I feel very angry at my spouse, when all of that, to really slow down and see what's going on.
And when you say in real time, you're also, I think, alluding to the fact that you cover in your book that the psychotherapy patient is only with their therapist. They're in therapy maybe an hour a week.
That's right.
And
That
there's all this other time where the work needs to happen.
exactly that. That's our homework, I think, is so valuable.
Yeah, yeah.
And psychoanalysts don't like it because, they came from the approach, and I think it's changing, that we just have to be so neutral, not to guide, not to put things in the patient's mind, but it became so passive, such a passive enterprise, that left the patients all to themselves to marinate in the same issues, in the same defenses. It didn't work so well. I have a few patients who came from years of psychoanalysis, and it gave them some insight, but didn't change the character.
Yes. Yes. Well, how can interested viewers, listeners find out more about you and your work?
So I have a website, efratginot.com. I'm also a painter, an
Oh, I
artist.
wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I wanted to
Oh, it's
ask you,
okay.
I knew that I saw that you're a painter, and I wanted to ask you, well, how does your painting fit into everything that we've been talking about in terms of anxiety and habits and all of that?
Yeah, it's I've been painting throughout really my whole life, and I think at the beginning it was a way to give voice to some of the anxieties. When I look back at some of the drawings I made as a child, as an adolescent, or as a young adult, they are not very pleasant looking. It's a lot of figures that are in pain, let's put it that way. So that was, and then I moved away to, so it was the yin yang. I moved to color. Now it's all about color. So yeah, it's another way. I love colors now. Yeah, been doing
Yeah.
it for a while.
Yeah. So do you have I had asked you how people could find you. Do you have a different website for yourself as a painter?
I put some work there on the
Okay.
website.
Okay. Okay. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to spend this time with you. I highly recommend your book to people who want to have a broader kind of understanding and a better sense of, I asked you, well, where is psychotherapy evolving to? But I really think that's what comes out in your book is a very strong appreciation for an evolutionary process and the integration that's going on
That's
in
right.
psychotherapy.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So I really want to thank you for being my guest today, Dr. Efrat Ginot.
That's very good. And I want to thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure. It's really very nice.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.